the second workshop will have Aldo Ceresa as the presenter. Aldo is a well-known shape note singer and composer. He has beloved songs in the Cooper edition of the Sacred Harp and the Shenandoah and Northern Harmony books. He's also a music instructor and a composer of instrumental music. So no further ado, we've got Aldo. Are you ready?
Hello. Thank you all for being here, wherever you may be. And special thanks to Eileen and Theo for putting this together and inviting me to do this. And for all the Chicago folk who've always been so kind and welcoming whenever I've been there. And Judy and Ted Mercer particularly were big inspirations and also really helpful when I first started trying to write songs. I don't know how many times Judy and Melanie and I and Molly Wedby and some other folks used to, I'd pull them out and give them a run through at around the kitchen table. And that was a really fun thing to do, especially with Judy being there. Just a couple of logistical things before we get going here. Mostly what I'm going to be doing is playing recordings that are all in a SoundCloud playlist that Theo's going to queue up. And you'll be able to view the scores of these songs if you want to sing along at home. And I'll talk a little bit maybe about each song and then some general things about my experience of trying to learn how to write these things and trial and error and things that were inspiring to me or things that were very instructive for me as I've been going along doing this. We'll do some Q&A at the end too. If people have any questions or anything about that, we can do that at the end. I started singing Sacred Harp 21 years ago, more or less. And even before then, though, I'd heard recordings of it for a number of years. The Boston Camerata recordings. Boston Camerata are an early music ensemble who have mostly done like Renaissance medieval music, but they've done a number of discs of early American music, including a number of songs in the Sacred Harp. And so I've been listening to that for a while and just love those records, even though it sounds nothing like what a real singing sounds like, but it's the same songs. And of course, they're brilliantly performed, so you can kind of hear all the interplay with the parts. And then also the Larry Gordon recordings, the original Rivers of Delight CD that I had, and then later a whole bunch of the other ones from Northern Harmony and all of that. But I hadn't actually been to a singing and didn't know they even existed outside of sort of what I imagine were places with no electricity, and there were like 11 people who were in their 80s and 90s who were singing out of, I didn't even know what the shape notes were either. I just knew the terms. So I imagine it was some strange kind of hieroglyphic notation that people were using. And in 2002, in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, where I live and still live now, I went to a gig in the neighborhood, and there was this guy, his name was Norris, and he played a lot of Appalachian music on various instruments, banjo, guitar, and auto harp and things. And he sang a solo version of Dave's Lamentation, accompanying himself with an auto harp, and then mentioned that it was from the songbook. And I said, oh, I've heard of that book. That's where all that dour Puritan music comes from that I like to listen to, right? And that's kind of what I used to call it. I didn't know what else to call it. Music my ancestors, like all the crazy New England people and all that kind of stuff. So I went and asked him about it. He's like, oh yeah, they sing in Brooklyn every month. I was like, wow, that's a strange thing. Does prove though that in New York City, it doesn't matter what you want or what you are looking for. If you search hard enough, you will find it. But anyway, I started going and then got into all of that. But going back even to before I'd actually been to a singing, I was always captivated by the sound of the stuff, the sound of the music. That's really all I had to go on initially, because I was just listening to records and CDs. So once I got going and had a songbook to look at, and mind you, I was always like Ted Johnson, I was pretty much an ear musician before I started doing this. I could haltingly plunk out a melody on a piano or pick it on a guitar, but I didn't use that for my own music making at all. So learning to sing out of a book was a big deal and kind of a foreign concept to me. And like, it was amazing once I started being able to do it, and then being able to analyze more, or try to anyway, what musically was so exciting to me about the sound of these songs. And of course, learning of the history of it too, it was like, okay, there's all these people from the very beginning that were just like ordinary people, country people who were laborers, people who didn't necessarily have a lot of music education, who wrote some really amazing, brilliant music, right? And that tradition has continued on through the whole time of shape note singing, all the way through. And like, you know, there are a lot of the songs that I like that were 200 years old, but there were some that were from people who were still alive, right? What an amazing idea. So surely, want to understand the thing, why not have a go at doing it myself, right? Trial and error, and well, let's see what happens. I'd written other kinds of music before, and you know, it's like, okay, let's see, what is this? And so that's how I got started. And my first few attempts, I'm sure, are quite abysmal. I haven't looked at them in a long time. And all the way through, it's just been a continuing journey of learning and trial and error, and kind of trying to understand the language of the book, particularly because Sacred Harp being functional music, it's written for a purpose. It's written for your friends to sing and enjoy. And then if you're really lucky, maybe people you don't even know will sing and enjoy it, maybe long after you're gone. And that's a real honor and kind of fun way to think about participating in the conversation of Sacred Harp singing and what it is, and being, you know, giving something back to the community, if you're able to do that, if you feel called to do that, which, you know, I really did feel that way, and at least wanted to have a try at it. So yes, just a couple other little things before we'll play the first track, which is called Monticello. There somewhere will be posted links to the camp handouts for the camp fossil law lessons that I taught for a number of years about writing music, which if you're a person who's just starting out at this, maybe that would be helpful to you. You can have a look at it, or ask me questions later about the classes that we did for a number of years at the camps. I think the link for the sort of how-to guide with a lot of charts and things in it will be posted somewhere. But meanwhile, let's have a look at Monticello, which, if you've downloaded the little packet, would be the first song. It's named for a street in Chicago, actually. That's why it's pronounced Monticello and not Monticello. Chris Richardson's house. For many years, Chris Richardson hosted the socials in her lovely home, and was a very kind host. And I always enjoyed visiting with people there. And I remember one year Buell Cobb came and read from his book there, and there was always good food, and you know, we'd sometimes have some after singing. So one question that people often ask, and that I certainly used to ask people, was, where do the names come from for these songs, right? Why are they all named after places and people and strange things that we can't even identify? And it goes back, of course, to an early practice in the church, where if you had a tune that didn't necessarily have words, you might just assign it a place name, or name it after some inanimate thing, or name it after a person, just as a way of naming them and sorting them out. And of course, there were quite commonly books that only had the music in, and then other books that only had the words in. And that's, of course, what the letters next to the song titles indicate, right? You could take a common meter song and stick it to any common meter set of words, and people used to do that a lot more fluidly than we do nowadays. But, you know, for my purposes, I often like to name my songs after the first place it's been sung, or its first place that I imagine it's going to be sung, particularly if I can tie it into a community that has, you know, that I have a close connection to, even if it's not where I live. So Chicago, I've got several things that have close Chicago connections. and this is the first one. One other thing too, I'll say is to me, writing a simple song, a plain song, something that just kind of doesn't have all the fugy bits and maybe just has a rhythm of long, short, long, short, long, like something in 3/4 or 3/2, is to me is actually to write a really interesting one of those, or a memorable one of those is kind of a much more difficult task than writing something that's florid. I mean, once you sort of develop a facility with this kind of stuff, you can kind of write something that kind of has little part entrances and filigrees and trills and whatever and stuff in it. And, you know, just kind of by virtue of that looks impressive sometimes to people or sounds impressive. But to write something that's as beautiful as Mir or you know, 93rd Psalm or Wyndham or anything like that, that's amazing. So this is one attempt I had at doing this. And we'll listen to a recording of just a bunch of folks that I got together with and sang with about 10 years ago in Massachusetts. Just after a singing said, hey, does anybody want to sing some new music? And about 15 people stuck around and we had a go at this and a few other songs. Let's have Monticello.
All right, here we go. And I'm trying to get it to play here. Here it is.
So yeah, that's I think pretty much everyone there was sight reading when we made that. And it was a beautiful 200-year-old church building with a high ceiling in Massachusetts, in rural Massachusetts. You know, there's just wood gallery and you know, the whole thing was wood and plaster and it just had a beautiful acoustic, and just made that recording just on the spot, which is such a magical experience. And just one of the great things about singing Sacred Harp, you acquire sight reading skills that you would, or at least in my case, I never would have thought I'd have, and can just do that. You can just look at something you've never even heard before and make it sound pretty good. Again, that was just, you know, a bunch of my friends, and we just kind of got together and had a go at that. That's another thing that for me has been a real practical help. And if I sort of would encourage people to do, if they're able to, is if you're writing music, I mean, absolutely show it to your friends, do some run throughs, have some discussions, get some feedback. I don't know how many hours I spent, you know, having chats and exchanging music with friends, and, you know, sending emails back and forth and all this kind of stuff. But making the recordings is great, because if you're lucky, you get something that sounds really nice that you can share with people. But, you know, maybe more often you get something and you go, oh, that's not quite right, right? I can't necessarily listen as well while I'm actually singing, but I can play it back later and kind of hear the part that kind of on every verse doesn't quite sound right. And then maybe ask people, like, that alto part never came through there. What, you know, was there something wonky about it? Was there something that was hard to sing, or, you know, so it's a really good revision tool. And that's, I mean, I've got 30 revisions of some of these songs that I've written, right? And I remember talking to Judy about that too. And of course, Judy Huff, and that's something that she did too. I think the version of Woodstreet that's in the book is like the 27th edit that she had, or something like that. I think I remember her telling me that. And of course, she did it all with a 4-track machine, like Ted Johnson was talking about, where you had to go through and sing one part at a time. And if there was something you didn't like, you had to go back and re-sing the whole thing. But of course, I'm just kind of listening, playing on the piano, singing it to myself, and dragging and dropping notes on the computer, which thankfully is a bit easier to work with. But having that feedback, especially since, you know, if you want people to sing your music, especially if you're not there and they maybe don't even know you, they're not just doing you a favor. You want it to be conversant with things that we already have, and in a language that they can speak or can sing in any way. And that's something we really talked about a lot in our workshops at the camps, and just conversations and composiums that we had as well. And I'll talk more about the composiums in a little bit. Influences of particular songs are really interesting to me, that the threads of borrowing that kind of go through the whole songbook, the Sacred Harp, and other books too. And whether it's conscious or unconscious, I think usually probably for most of us, it's unconscious, where there'll be just some little lick, or maybe just the way a fuguing part works, or some little passage, melodic words, I call them often. And in that camp handout, there's a whole little section about that, kind of about learning the language and the little melodic words, the little phrases like sol la sol fa la sol fa, or la fa la sol la mi la sol la, the kind of trade back things that happen in songs melodically. And so this song, the one we just heard, to me, it's definitely got some 33 in the bottom Abbeville in it, maybe 390 New Prospect, where you have that little Scotch snap thing where you have a syncopation with a short note followed by a long note. Comes to mind. I'd be curious if people hear other songs that, you know, influence that one, or some of the other ones we'll listen to, that they, you know, things that maybe some of these songs will call to mind of songs they already know, because to me that's part of good writing. Often you don't want to be just kind of grabbing somebody's work and putting your name on it, or you don't want the whole melody to be lifted from something else. But if there's just a little hint of something here and there, it's kind of sweet often, and functionally sometimes makes the music work better. The real hard thing in the challenge for many of us anyway, I think might agree, is trying to write something that fits in the idiom, fits in the style, is conversant with what we have and what people are accustomed to, but somehow is new and interesting as well. So that's kind of always the, you know, the challenge for me of trying to write this stuff. Let's look at the second song, which is called Moreno, on page 2.
Alright. So I bring that right up, or do you want to say a little bit more about it before?
Yeah, just briefly. It's named for Kevin Moreno, who's a singer from Baltimore, who used to travel a lot with, and is good, good friend and cohort. And Kevin shared a love that I also have for these camp meeting songs. And again, learning the language of the Sacred Harp, you kind of recognize that there are different styles within the style. So there are the fuguing songs that have all the parts coming in one after another, and then there are the sort of slow plain tunes or song tunes like Mir or something like that. But then we have these camp meeting songs, which are the really rowdy ones often, right? And the ones that have repeated refrains and choruses in them. And those, of course, arose, a lot of them in the Second Great Awakening in America, where they'd have these big open air meetings and people would just kind of make them up on the spot, or whole choruses would kind of get borrowed from one song to another, or what's called wandering couplets, where you're taking a couple of lines from a hymn that everybody knows by heart and can just do from memory, but sticking it to new music and then maybe adding a new refrain or a new chorus to it. And these are challenging, I think, for a lot of us to write, because we're not living in that culture anymore. And those songs were so experiential. They came out of a certain time and place and experience that people were having that most of us are not replicating, but it's such a compelling subgenre. So this was an attempt by me to write a camp meeting song that, in my mind, is influenced by things like the Golden Harp in the book Warrenton. You'll hear in the chorus, it's the rhythm, there's a lot of eighth notes, this kind of stuff that Warrenton and some other songs have. A song called Lisbon that's in the Social Harp, which has some of the same words as this, and which is also in Missouri Harmony and Shenandoah Harmony, I believe. And some other stuff like from the American Vocalist Songbook and other things. And this is sung by the same group as the previous one, just sight reading it, lasting through about 10 years ago. So there's that one. It's a little tricky maybe to get those rhythmic passages, but if you're accenting well, something, again, anyone who's been to a workshop or a camp class has heard about accenting the music, right? It's a really important feature of Sacred Harp, where it's why we're all waving our hands, is to stay together in rhythm, and kind of punching that in the music a bit, or actually more properly pulling back on the unaccented notes is how you kind of can keep something like that together, even when you're sight reading it, which those people did really well. I mean, again, as memory serves, I don't think any of those folks had ever seen that song before, before we recorded it. So let's move on to the next one, which will be called Newtown on page 3. And this is named after Newtown, Connecticut. I wrote it right after that horrible school shooting, which now is 10 years ago. I think it was written within a month of Monticello as well. And that's happened a few times, I'm sure. Well, to me, I know it has, and probably to a lot of other writers of this stuff. Something happens in the world, and it makes you feel like you need to write something, or ideas come to you. And particularly the text that I chose to go with this is a text seeking solace and comfort in a time of deep distress, right? So that's where this tune came from. I mean, like all of us, I was really affected when that happened. And it's not far from where I live either, actually. So anyway, this is a group singing in St. Catherine's College at the University of Cambridge. I was lucky enough to do a workshop there about 10 years ago. So we had all these choristers, and my job was to teach them to sing Sacred Harp, as opposed to teaching them how to sing, because they already knew how to do that quite well, right? Didn't need any help from me for that, right? In fact, I needed help from them. But to sort of bring stylistic elements of Sacred Harp into their singing, to teach them how to do that, and in a sense, not sing sometimes what's written on the page. And they were just such a joy to work with, because I could just ask them to do anything and they would do it, right? So again, they're sight reading a song that they'd never seen before. Let's hear it. I love that recording because it brings back a fond memory and a really wonderful experience that I had. But I can hear Finn Titvermach, who now lives in Germany, but at the time was living in Norwich in England. And I can hear him singing treble up there. And that's one of the things about Sacred Harp recordings that can be so wonderful, is you hear that one voice of somebody and you recognize it. especially when they're not around anymore, or even if you don't get to see them very often. So it's like, oh, there's Finn, right? That's nice. Let's move ahead to Neasden Lane. That's on page 6 of your handout, if you're looking at it. And this one's named for a street in London, where the monthly singings were held when they only had one monthly singing a very long time ago, and in a church called St. Mary's there in Neasden. And that was my first experiences in Europe were traveling to the UK and specifically staying in London with Michael Walker, who was living there at the time. And people were so kind and welcoming, and all the times I've been to the UK, including just a couple of months ago. So I wanted to write something for them. And I also was thinking of the space, because it's a medieval church, even though where they sang was actually in the parish hall, but it also had a nice acoustic. But I think I was thinking of the church itself, and those slow psalm tunes and plain tunes can sound so lovely in spaces like that. Somebody just the other day posted a video of Dan Britton leading Cobb at St. Finbarr's Cathedral in Cork. And I happened to be there that day too. And I remember seeing that, or I remember when we did it, and seeing the video brought back a very pleasant memory, and it just sounds so good because of the reverberation. So that's where this comes from. And it's a song to me that's definitely influenced by 73 on the Bottom in the Sacred Harp Arlington, which is it's based on an Old English melody by an 18th century English composer. But also O'Leary by Ted, before I even knew Ted. In fact, I think the first email exchange I ever had with Ted Mercer was about some songbook or other that we were both interested in on eBay or something like that. But I mentioned to him how much I loved that song and how good it had sounded, I think, the night before when we sung it in New York. The rhythms in there, I think. And I think this might also be have a little Raymond Hamrick in it as well. But this is just another ad hoc group. This is what we would do at camp, every session that I attended anyway. This was the adult session of Camp Fossil Law in Alabama in 2017. And we just were ripping through songs at the Composium at the end on the last day, where people had been working on songs and doing a round robin exercise called Team Tunesmith, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then also bringing in their own pieces that they'd written at home and sight reading them. And so let's hear this, Neasden Lane. Oh, that's the wrong Neasden Lane. It's the earlier one.
Stand by. I am. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry about that. Here we go.
Oh, no worries. We might get to hear that one at the end. Yep, people just start reading. A lot of us with very tired voices. I know my voice sounds kind of tired there. It was the last day at camp, but did a great job with it. And, again, that's just so invigorating when you can just hear all this new music and sing all this music and hear your own music sung and get a sense of what it really sounds like sort of instantaneously in a group like that. The next song we'll have a look at is called Chattahoochee, which is on page 4. Named for the Chattahoochee Convention, of course, which was a convention I attended many times. And I believe the first time we sang through this was in Wilson's Chapel, which is that beautiful building that Marcia mentioned in the earlier session, that was just purpose-built for singing. And the inside of it, the interior, everything is yellow pine. The benches, the floor, the walls, the ceiling. So it's like singing on inside of a giant cigar box, right? Which is perfect for Sacred Harp and was a great way to first hear this in that environment. They let us stay, a few of us, after the singing and kind of try out some new songs. This recording is from a composium, and a composium is a session, as many of you probably are aware, where it's a sort of a workshop thing where people can bring in their new songs that they've written, have a go at singing them, get a good sense of what they sound like, and then get feedback from singers. And this was a concept we started back in 2006 or 7. And of course, there have been numbers of them at the camps and at various singings around the world, and they've been immeasurably helpful to me and I think some other people, I hope anyway. I claim trademark on the word composium. That's my, if I've contributed nothing else to Sacred Harp or to the lexicon, that's my one claim to fame there. Trying to think of something to name these things 15 years ago, and that was the thing. But this is a song in particular that has a couple things going on. Number one, it's really influenced by that first half of the 20th century period of writing by the Densons and Marcus Kegel and O.A. Paris and the McGraws. And this is something a number of us were really trying to capture at that time. I remember trying to understand writing those kinds of songs, things like 340 or 392 or 283, or, these really bouncy, boisterous fuguing songs, right? And major key and minor key, but this was my attempt at an F major one. So many of them are in F major. How can you write something in that style, capture that style, but try and also do something new and interesting, right? That's a big challenge. So this was an attempt to do that. I also realized after I wrote it that it's definitely got some 222 Ocean in it. It's got some 434 Fillmore in it. There's one little passage in the treble that you hear toward the end that definitely, I think, pretty sure I lifted it from Fillmore. And then in the alto, you'll hear a little bit of Liberty, the Cooper Book alto in there, just a little snippet that maybe you'll recognize. So let's give this one a go. So another thing about that song too is it's for and of my stuff anyway. It's a real example of word painting. I think something that's really helpful. It certainly was to me, and I think maybe to a lot of the rest of us as well, especially when we're starting out, is having a text in front of you if you're going to try and write music. One reason for that is very practical. If you haven't got the meters in your head of how the words, kind of the phrasing of how the words were likely to fit, and you write a piece of music and then you try and put words to it later, you might find out that your song is in, 13s and 7s and 6.5 meter, right? It's hard to find a text to make it fit. But also good words can inspire good music. If you've got something, especially if it's really evocative language, right, and imagery and things, and you can kind of put that in the music, which is a very old tradition and all kinds of music, and certainly it is in Sacred Harp, shape note, and its predecessors, where the highest note of the song might be on the word on high, or if you think of 218, where all you do is fly for a whole page, right? Fly. And that song, I believe I had shake is a shaking thing, right? The note shake there, the high thing happens, leveled low. I did a little syncopation on low, oh, right? And yeah, that was kind of where that one came from. Let's go on to page 8. We'll skip Grand Ferry for now. Page 8, which is called Walker. And this is, of course, named for Michael Walker, who I mentioned earlier, who lived in London for a long time and now lives in Ireland, in County Cork. Is a good friend of mine and was a real mover and shaker in the UK when he was there. And the London singing expanded greatly in the time that he was living there and when I was coming to visit quite often. And of course now has been a great help and will be the chair of the next Cork convention when they have it, whenever that may be, seeing how COVID goes. It's not going to be this year, it's going to have to be next year now. But Michael loved this song. Like, I didn't write this with Michael in mind. I wrote it originally and called it Jerusalem Ode because of the text, and I didn't know what else to call it. But he loved it so much, and every time we'd sing it, he'd get, he'd be really into it and tell me how much he liked it. And, he just would talk about it a lot. And I submitted this to the Northern Harmony 10 years ago when they were doing the last revision of it. And I sent it to Larry Gordon and with a few other things that ended up in there. And they were going to accept it. I'm like, that's great. I'm going to change the name to Michael because it'll be in a book and it'll have his name on it. And Michael was so supportive of me bringing me over to the UK to teach and just housing me and being a good friend that I really wanted to sort of do that as a gesture and as a sort of a gift to him. So this is a pocket symphony, and the pocket symphony is a lovely phrase that I learned from Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys when he was talking about the song Good Vibrations, which, if you don't know the song, listen to it. It's got all these different little parts that get magically, wonderfully strung together in like 3-minute space. There's like at least 4 or 5 different discrete parts of that song. And that's kind of how this one came out. I didn't intend it that way when I started writing it, but it just kind of came out that way. And it's definitely got some big influences from the Sacred Harp in it. Milford, the song starts out with just the tenor, and then the bass and the alto come in and the treble. But that thing with just starting out with the tenor by itself comes, I think, from Milford. The song Greenland on page 301, where it has what does Greenland do? It starts out in 4 and then goes to 6 and then goes to 2 at the end, 2/4 time. These different time signatures like this one sort of does. Primrose Hill has a little bit of that, where most of it is in 6, and then you go into that little 3/4 section that's slow, and then go back into 6. Animation on page 103. The part of the song of Walker that's in 6/8 was pointed out to me later. Like, oh, that reminds me of Animation. I'm like, huh, I don't even know that song. Let's have a look at it. And I was like, look at that. I don't think I've ever even sung Animation, but maybe I had, and it was a subconscious thing. I don't know. It's just the flavor of it. I didn't lift the melody or anything, but those kind of things, again, I revel in with this kind of music because it is a conversational thing, right? It's meant to be part of a larger tradition. It's not meant to reinvent the wheel. Yet, again, the challenge is to try and do something interesting and new within these strictures of the style. So let's hear Walker. So one thing I've got to mention about that's another Camp Fossil Law Composium. So it's the last day of camp. We've been singing all week. People are tired. Sometimes their voices are tired. Yet all those people were sight reading. It was wonderful. And it was in the Ark at Camp Lee. If any of you ever went to Camp Fossil Law and remember the big log building where we used to sing sometimes. And we were over in the corner so that it wouldn't be too reverberant. We could sort of still understand one another, but it made for a really nice recording. And that's from 13 years ago. And it's still, I guess, my favorite recording of that song that I have. I have 2 or 3 recordings of it. So let's move on to Mulkern on page 9. Again, another song named for a friend. I wrote this for my good friend, Gregory Mulkern, who now lives in France for the time being, but most recently his more permanent base of operations, I think, is Portland, Oregon. And Greg was really active in singing for a while. I mean, he's not now, but he's still a good friend. And he was writing music and I was writing music. We had all these conversations and gave each other all of our songs and tried things out. And, I wanted to essentially give him a Christmas gift. So I was thinking of Greg when I wrote this, and even chose a text that's sort of about seeking inspiration, in your art, can be interpreted that way. And wrote this, and I feel like it's got a little bit of Glory Shown Around from the Cooper book in it. There's one little lick in there that I think I probably grabbed from that, and maybe something like Mount Vernon in the Denson book on page 110. But this one's a real question about, there's all kinds of stuff in there that's solidly in the idiom in terms of the melodic and harmonic stuff that it does, right? The way the melodies move and the chords and everything that happen. But then it does some things that are a little unusual in terms of how the fugue bits come in and out. So maybe this was an attempt to try and, again, write something that's new and interesting, but still fits in the style, and is something that's recognizable as Sacred Harp. I don't know. This is a small group recording that we did in the photography studio of Jesse Carlsberg's dad in Massachusetts 13 years ago. There were only 7 of us. And these can be such wonderful sessions if you can get a small group, even just a quartet, together and try things out that way, because you really have to lock in, and you really can lock in a smaller group of people sometimes, and then really hear the music, especially when you have a chance to go back and listen to the recording. I'll apologize in advance. I do remember that I think I had the flu when we were doing this, in the pre-COVIDian age, when people would still do that. I don't think I would do that now, show up somewhere and have the flu and sing, but I think my voice is not the greatest. But let's hear Mulkern. Yeah, I can hear my voice just going terrible. But anyway, let's move on to Edgewood, which is page 10. I mentioned a little bit earlier about Northern Harmony. Northern Harmony was one of my first exposures to the sound of Sacred Harp, even though it's not Sacred Harp, it's a cousin. The way they sort of perform the music is not, not what we do in practice, but there's such beautiful recordings and there's so many of them. And of course, I always hope maybe, once I started writing music, like, wow, I wonder if someday I can get these guys to sing one of my songs. And, I've met Larry Gordon a few times and I've met some of the others a few times, but I never participated in any of their camps or workshops and didn't really know any of them very well. Just submitted those songs to the book, and he put several of them in the latest Northern Harmony songbook, the black one, the 5th edition. And this was one of them. And then lo and behold, I remember I was in Chicago and found out that they'd made a really nice recording of Edgewood here. and put it on one of their CDs. And so that was a real honor, and it makes the song sound really good. And it's a song that I feel kind of fits their style. They tend to like a lot of the New Englandy sound of fuguey songs, minor things, which this is. It's definitely got some 272 exhortation in it, maybe some Daniel Reed, something like Russia. And it's on their CD called Treasures of Grace from 2014, I guess. And there's also a YouTube video of it that I made a long time ago, which has photos of people singing. And of course, these photos are from Chicago. They're from the Irish American when we were having one of these winter workshops in person, maybe about 8 or 9 or 10 years ago. But anyway, let's hear Edgewood, page 10. Two-pager. Yeah, they have such a sweet sound. It was a real honor to. They've made recordings of a few of my songs, and it's always and I don't know about it ahead of time. Larry would just send them to me, or I would just find them online sometimes and be like, wow, that's so nice. Let's move on to Greenwood, page 12. This is a song that speaking of Northern Harmony, like when I started writing this I had that sound in my head when I was writing it, right? And again, at that point, I'd never met them. I didn't know them. I didn't have any relationship with them. But because I had that sound in my head, and right after the Northern Harmony songbook came out, I think was when I sort of finished this, I sent it off to Larry. And then next thing I knew, there was a video of them singing it in the Republic of Georgia on a TV show. That was what they started out their set with, was this song, and they sang it on their tour that they did that year. And that was something really special for me, because I had that sound in my head when I wrote it. Now we get into the question of idiom. What's in the idiom and what is not in the idiom? What falls in the spectrum of things that work in the context of Sacred Harp? And that's an eternal question that people talk about in workshops and camp classes and discussions online and whatever else. and people have different ideas about it. Is this a Sacred Harp song? I don't know. I don't think it's particularly hard to sing. It's one of these things that I think maybe looks more difficult on the page than it actually is, because I'm using language in here that's mostly stuff that would be familiar. There's not a lot of weird rhythms or melodic jumps or anything like that. But I'd be interested to hear what people think about this song, whether it sort of fits in the idiom of Sacred Harp, or whether it's more something of like, you know, a Northern Harmony kind of song, or something sort of related, but not really firmly within the tradition. The only song I could think of that was a big influence on me for this one was a song called Canterbury New, which is in the American Vocalist songbook from Maine, and it's on the American Vocalist CD, that I had for years, that I'm sure is how I got it in my head. I think it's also in the Shenandoah. I'm not sure, it might be in the Missouri Harmony, something like that, but Canterbury New is the only specific thing I could think of. But let's hear Greenwood.
My life's a shame, my days a hasty climb. My Lord is my praise, my dust sweet truth, sweet truth.
This is the wrong one, I'm sorry. Just leave it. Just leave it.
My Savior shall I see. Sweet truth, I shall arise and with these eyes. My Savior shall I see. My Savior shall I see. My peaceful grave shall keep my bones until I wake from sleep and sleep and my bed. Sweet truth to me I shall arise and with these eyes my Savior shall I see. Sweet truth to me I shall arise and with these eyes my Savior shall I see. My Savior shall I see. Sweet truth, sweet to me I shall arise and with these eyes my Savior shall I see. My Savior shall I see.
So that was not actually, that's a different recording. That's a quartet with Larry Gordon and Gideon Crevichet from the Starry Mountain Singers, and can't remember who the other two are on that, but they just sang that one day and sent it to me. And that's really interesting because they put some anticipations and a couple little ornamentations and things in there that I didn't write in, which sound lovely. I love them. I don't know if that would work so well in a big group. And when the recording that's on the Northern Harmony CD of a bigger group doing it, and when they were doing it on the TV show that I mentioned, they didn't do that. But one of the wonderful things as a writer of any kind of music is when you can give it to other people and then it takes on a life of its own, right? I didn't have any of that in mind when I wrote it. I love the way it sounds. It's beautiful. Those little things that they put in there. And of course, so much of our music in here, we don't sing exactly what's on the page, right? There's all kinds of little conventions that are oral tradition or that people learn, or maybe you're even specific to a particular family or group or place that get used in the music. So I really enjoyed hearing that as well when they sent it to me. The whole playlist of all these things, including the other version of that song sung by a bigger group, that's really lovely, Northern Harmony group. And then another version of it that Rick Cunningham, who's a singer who lives in Texas, he made a whole CD of instrumental versions of sacred harp and shape note songs, and he put sort of a 12-string electric guitar version of that he made. That sounds like Led Zeppelin, so it's kind of great. But anyway, let's move on to Frenche. It's page 13. It's named for a village in Gloucestershire near Bristol, where they have their all-day singing every year in a lovely Quaker meeting house that was built in about 1803, if I remember right. And of course, my favorite recordings of all my music mostly are the ones that I'm not on. Some of us don't really always like the sound of our own voice, right? So those Northern Harmony things and some of the other Northern Harmony things that I've got. And then the next few that we're going to hear are from Jack Gehring, who's a singer that lives in Winchester in England. And I met her a few years ago, and she's just a lovely person. And she sings there with Nigel and Brenda in Winchester. And they've got a lovely little group there that meets every couple of weeks. And she's got a couple of kids, and her husband are all lovely folks. And she sings, I think the other day she was trying to teach her son one of my songs, she told me. And her daughter also has a lovely voice, just like her mom. But this is in the tradition of what Judy Huff did. Judy Huff made two whole CDs of 4-track recordings of her overdubbing her own voice. And I just love hearing Jack sing this stuff. It's great for me in terms of writing and revising, because I can really hear all the parts, and there's something I don't like, I can change it. But it's also just such a pretty sound. Jack's recordings are often sung at concert pitch, so if you're singing along, it might be a little higher than what you're used to. Just keep that in mind. And she makes these in her little sort of music room, her back room, where her the kids keep their toys and all these kinds of things. And it's carpeted and it's completely dead. So I've generally added some reverb to them. And I kind of like to think it almost sounds like a choir of Jack singing in Winchester Cathedral. So let's hear Frenchie. So, it's a different sound. Obviously, it doesn't sound like Sacred Harp singers, but that song, to me, I think the biggest influence on that probably was Sacred Throne. But hopefully it's in the style enough that people can sing it easily and sight read it, and just, those two little holds in there are just kind of, so you get two holds for the price of one song, right? Sacred Throne only has the one. That one has two. But yeah. Let's have a look at Highland on page 14. This is another song with a Chicago connection. It's named after Highland Street in Chicago, where the Wedbies used to live. I used to stay with the Wedbies sometimes before I started singing more often with Ted Mercer. And this is another one. I don't know. Does it fit in the Sacred Harp idiom or doesn't it? I don't think it's particularly hard to sing. It's an A minor fuguing song. And it's definitely got some influence from something maybe like Immensity, the way the parts come in, the rhythm of it. Maybe I got that from Novokoski, although it probably could have come from a number of other places. There's a song called Farmington by Alexander Gillett that Northern Harmony recorded at one point, that I think maybe I had that more in my head than anything else, but it's not really that much like this. But this is another beautiful Jack recording. And this is only on the words. Let's hear Highland.
Now let our morning hearts revive, and all our days, and all our tears be dry, and all our tears be dry. Why should those eyes be drowned in grief, which view the lamb so nigh, 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 which view the lamb so nigh.
That's another instance too of a song. I started writing that, I think even before 2010, and I had the music in my head and wasn't paying much attention to where the words would go. So it took me a while to find something and kind of to make it a text that fit that music that I could kind of wedge in there and make fit. It's a very short fuguing song and there's a lot of repeated words. But that's maybe a cautionary tale for writing from a text rather than not paying much attention and having to sort of squeeze one in later on. Let's look at Grand Fairy. And Theo, if you would cue up that new Grand Fairy recording that I just sent you this morning, that's at the end of the playlist. Grand Fairy is on page 7. This is a song that I wrote around the same time I wrote Mulkern that we heard a little while ago. And it, Jack literally just made this morning. I wrote to her a while ago and said that I was going to be doing this thing, and she just sent me this. So I carved it all up, edited. There were the bits of the chair moving around or the keying at the beginning of the song, and put some reverb on it, and just posted it a little while ago. And it's a nice recording of a song that does. It's named for a park in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. But there's 3 things I think that happen in this song that I was kind of playing around with, which is, one is that rhythm of the fugue, which has that bum, 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 bum thing, like Invitation 327 has, or Worcester on 195, or Morgan on 304, that rhythm at the beginning of the fugue that I had stuck in my head from one of those songs. And then it does a lot of going up and down by step. Which I think I got from the alto line in Aiken, amongst other things, 472. So there's a little Dan Britton in there. And then maybe sort of like something a little bit of My Brightest Days and some of those B-flat songs. But specifically, there's some discords on some of the unaccented notes that go by very quickly, which is a thing that's really happens a lot in our music, and we often don't notice it. And so I kind of left some of those in that I might have otherwise taken out. So anyway, Grand Fairy, page 7.
Sa 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 la la so si sa la sa so la mi sa so 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 la fa so 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 fa fa so fa la so fa so la so fa so so si fa so so fa so la so fa so so la so la so fa. Sweet rivers of redeeming love lie just before mine eyes. Had I the pinion of a day that in those rivers fly. Had I the pinions of a dove, I to those rivers fly. A few more days or years at most, my troubles will be o'er. I hope to join the heavenly host and sing the Canaan shore. I hope to join the heavenly host and sing on Canaan's shore. My raptured soul shall drink and feast in love's unbounded sea. The glorious hope of endless rest is ravishing for me. The glorious hope of endless rest is ravishing for me. The glorious hope of endless rest is ravishing for me. The glorious hope of endless rest is ravishing for me.
Okay. We'll look at Alfred Lake on page 15. This is named for a place in Maine because stylistically, I think it gets a lot from the American vocalist and a composer who was even earlier than the American vocalist who lived in Maine, Abraham Maxim, who wrote Portland in the Sacred Harp and also the original version of Heavenly Dove. And is this Sacred Harp or is this not Sacred Harp? I don't know, but Jack did a really lovely job with it. And yeah, let's just have a look at page 15 and we can hear Alfred Lake.
Although I've got two audio recordings named Alfred Lake in your playlist.
Oh, okay, yeah. There's another one from actually that was recorded in Chicago over at the field house at Kilburn Park, I think. But let's hear the other one, the Jack one.
Is that the
More toward the bottom.
more towards the bottom? Got it. Here we go.
So that one to me is, I mean, first of all, I think it's important, very important to think about what's in the idiom and what isn't, and have, doesn't mean everything you do has to be by the book or anything, and certainly not to stultify creativity at all, but speaking in a language. But, even if you're not in the main language, sometimes you have a dialect, right? And those can be fun ways to explore, the idea of what is in the idiom and what isn't as well. And that song certainly does have some things that I got from the Sacred Harp in it. It's got some Granville in it, I think. It might have a little bit of Poland in it. Those songs already sort of maybe being on the outer edges of the style. And then again, it's particularly, there's a song called Hatfield by Abraham Maxim that's in the American Vocalist, and there are recordings of it on SoundCloud. You can search for it. Just searching Hatfield, an American Vocalist, and hear that. I think that was where that one sort of came from. But again, I love what Jack did with it. So anyway, let's move on to New York, page 16.
This also has 2 audio recordings.
Yes, the Jack one, the one toward the bottom.
Okay, very good.
This is a song that I wrote about 10 years ago. And I had an earlier song that I'd written that was okay. Mainly what I liked about it was the beginning section, and it was called York. So the beginning section of New York is actually just pilfered from Old York. So that's partly why I named it New York, right? Because there was an earlier song called York. Here's New York. And then, of course, I live in New York. Okay, got to name one after my hometown at some point, I suppose. Still haven't got one called Brooklyn, though. And it was also first sung at the New York Convention. A group of us sang it in 2012. So I was like, okay, New York it is. And I think this one might have some Greenwich in it, maybe a little bit of Ye Heedless One, maybe Wondrous Cross. The big thing about this one was it really was one that I was stuck on for a long time, sort of in the middle of the fuguing section, where the alto trill kind of fun little thing is now. There was nothing there for the first few years of this song's existence. And I sent it around to a bunch of people. Here's version 1, here's version 2. I sent it to Jack, I sent it to Ava Strebeck, I sent it to Dan Britton, I think, maybe Finn. I can't remember, several other people. And what do you think? Which one's better? Because I can't make up my mind. So I got some real help by sharing it with people and getting their feedback. And then Jack made this lovely recording of it.
When men of mischief rise in secret against the skies, thy hand shall sweep them to the grave, and oh beyond the tomb, and devils that devil dress the tears that doom, and oh beyond the tomb, how dreadful is the doom, where not a hand is reached to save, where not a hand is reached to save. Themselves their watch shall snare, the pits their hands prepare. Before their feet destruction spreads. The false plots they devise, shall fall with vengeance on their heads, shall fall with vengeance on their heads. The false plots
Let's take a look at Carrollton, page 18. This is another one that's got some word painting in it. I had the text and was thinking of the words when I was writing it. Was thinking of something like 532, which is one of my most favorite songs, and it has all this stuff going on, all these rhythms and part entrances and little things, filigrees, but yet it holds together so well. And like, you know, if I could never say what my favorite Sacred Harp song was at any given time, really, but I remember posing the question to myself and maybe some of my friends as well. If there was one song that you could have written, you know, just because you love the way it's written so well, or that you admire it so much, or it brings you so much joy when you sing it or when you hear it, what would it be? And I think my answer might still be 532, because it does all these things, and it's in some ways it's like the quintessential Sacred Harp song, but in some ways it does things other Sacred Harp songs don't do. It has some gospel influence in it. So I think I had that sort of idea in my head, just like, how many things can I get away with? How many ways can I just be expressive and try to evoke joy when I was writing this one? Let's hear Jack sing it, page 18.
And this is the second of the two Carrolltons in the audio list?
Yeah, it'd be the one toward the bottom. Yeah.
All right, here we go.
So hopefully that's another one of those that looks maybe more difficult on the page than it is to sing, because most of what it's doing melodically is stuff you've probably done 1,000 times at a singing in other songs, all the little runs up and down and stuff like that. It's not doing bizarre things, and it's got some rhythmic syncopations in it and stuff, but it's not stuff you haven't seen before. I don't know, time will tell if anyone ever actually sings it. But yeah, I think we've sort of reached my allotted time. I've got one more Jack recording that I could share. But before, if we even have time to do that, I'd be happy to know if anybody has any questions or comments or anything they'd like to talk about, since I've been playing music at you and talking at you for well over an hour now.
I have a question.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I have a question. I'm wondering what you're working on now.
Well, that's a really good question, and I didn't get to that yet. One of the things that you notice the dates on these things, if you look at them, a lot of them are from 7, 8, 9, 10, even like 12 years ago. Part of that, a big part of that, I think for me was I need the interaction. I need the energy from people actually singing it and being around me to be inspired to do this stuff. And, I haven't really been going to singing at all much for quite a while now. But even before that, before COVID and everything else, people, I used to have a group that lived near me or people that I would see all the time. We would be handing out our songs all the time. A little bit like, what certainly what Judy would describe. And I think Ted Johnson touched upon briefly in just, a little while ago. It's hard for me to really sink my teeth into it or even be thinking about it or have that, as much as stuff would just be going around my head all the time, but it's because I was so in it and of it, and I'm not anymore. So I don't really have much within the last few years. I have a few things. And actually just the other day, I pulled out a couple of things that I'd sort of half finished and was working on them a bit. But for me personally, it's really hard to have the energy and the inspiration to do that without the energy from the people. And I get, some of those songs were little ideas that would pop into my head and I'd write them down, but I almost never would write a song all the way through. There'd be some little inspiration. It's the Thomas Edison 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration thing, because I'm a great tinkerer and reviser, and I had to really chisel a lot of stone away to get some of those songs. And it took me quite a while sometimes, because I'd get little bits of ideas here and there, or I would just have to go over and over and over and try different things until something worked well or was satisfactory to me and to the people that sang it. So I think that's why.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about when something is within the Sacred Heart tradition and when it's kind of on the edge, because to me, the ones you were questioning, I still heard enough of, songs that we've sung that I would say, well, of course. So I'm a little unclear.
Yeah, and that's a really subjective thing, and you could spend an hour talking about it and still not necessarily come away with a better sense of what that means to you or to anyone else. For people that are interested in doing this, the best thing that you can do is sing. But the other thing is do your homework and study the book and really start to think about songs that you like. And there's so much, there's several different sub-styles in here over the different geographic areas and different periods of time and different composers themselves and families and all of that. But there's a string that ties most of it together. So, and sometimes it's really obvious. So we've done lessons on this. This is something I did a lot of thinking about and work on a few years ago. Like so many songs in this book, you can trace back to one particular antecedent. So look at page 430, Arbacucci, and then look at page 214, Repentance. Like whether T.J. Denson knew it or not, I would argue that he must have had that in his head. Repentance, that is, which is from 1800 in the early 1900s when he wrote Arbacucci, which is wonderful because they're both great songs. I love both of those songs, and they're different enough, but the key is the same. The way the fuguing parts in both of those songs have a double fugue, the way those come in is the same, right? I don't think that's an accident. And that's So that's a really firm example of something that maybe you could talk about, that, okay, that's in there. You know, some of these other songs, including newer ones, maybe they have harmonic things that most of the songs don't do, or melodic things that most of the songs don't do, or rhythmic things. And that's not a bad thing, because the music has always evolved. You can point to the New England composers and think of Daniel Reed and William Billings and songs like Calvary and Russia and Evening Shade and, you know, whatever other of that New England music. And there's tons of that in the book that people love and sing all the time. Stratfield amongst them, that we saw with Ted and Marcia. And that's a style that's sort of quantifiable in a lot of ways. But it's very different by the time you get into even the mid-19th century with the people in South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama writing music. They're related, but the people down there were much more using folk melodies and harmonizing them. They were using their harmonies a little different. And then later on in the 19th century, when more Southern sacred harp singers started revisiting and writing new fuguing tunes, that big explosion that happens sort of as a trickle of it in the 1840s and 50s, but really in the 1860s, stuff like Fillmore and Eternal Day and a bunch of other songs that we sing all the time that are wonderful. And it's like these guys trying to work out like what a fuguing tune is and how to write one. And their version of it is different than Daniel Reed or Billings. You can hear it. If you sing a bunch of the one group of songs together and then you sing another, there are things that have a different flavor, but they're also clearly related. And then you go into the 20th century with the 20th century writers, all the Denson and Kegel stuff, again, that people sing all the time. That's a slightly different flavor too. And then you get into something like Raymond Hamrick is his own flavor, kind of. He's drawing a lot more on the stuff from the 1700s, actually, is what he's doing. His favorite composer was William Billings. So the harmonic language is different and it's evolving, and that's wonderful. It's a living, breathing thing, but it's not, you don't have something that's completely unrelated to what came before in the book, or, if you do, it's probably not going to work very well. And so I guess, I don't know, is that a helpful answer? Just harmonic and melodic language that's kind of on the edge, especially if you're, song that's got a lot of accidentals in it. I mean, we have a few of them, in the book, some sharps on minor songs, but not very much. If your song's really full of that, and all the chords are triads, they're filled in with all three notes of the chord, rather than having a lot of dyads with only the 1 and the 5, which, so much sacred harmony is open fifths and stuff like that, then maybe that doesn't sound quite as much like sacred harp. I mean, but it's very subjective. People have very different ideas about it, and it's fun to have the conversation and to think about it, right? In the end, it's the singers decide like what works and what doesn't.
Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else?
I've got one, actually.
Yes.
I'm always curious, because I love text a lot, around where people are finding text and whether a composer prefers to start with the text or to start with the tune and find something that matches the meter and matches all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, it's probably about 50-50, because I do just get ideas, musical ideas, melodies, whatever pop into my head, or I'm fiddling around the piano or something like that. And so then I'll start writing it and then find the words later. And I've done this enough that sort of when I start writing something, I pretty quickly realize what the text meter feel is. It's like, oh, that's going to be a common meter one or a short meter one, or it's in 8s and 7s or whatever it is. So usually I'm able to get away with that at this point, but earlier on, not at all. I wrote things in bizarro meter any number of times and then had to try and squeeze words in. But then there's something really special about having a text that really moves you, that you feel a real connection to, whether it's from an old book. I've got a bunch of old word books, hymnals that just have the words in, from the 1700s and 1800s and things. And so I used to pour through those a lot. Or The American Vocalist, again, that I've mentioned several times. It's a book from Maine, and it's got tons of poetry in it. there's much more poetry actually than there is music in there. And I've definitely drawn, because I like a lot of the music that's in that book, I've drawn a lot of poetry from that. But I've also drawn a lot of poetry that's already in the Sacred Harp and just written another completely different tune for it. So it can go either way. I think it's really wonderful when the music and the words interact in a particular way that just enhances both. And a real prime example of that is just Amazing Grace. Those words were already 70 years old when William Walker took whatever tune that is, because it's not an original tune of his. It's either a folk tune or it's based on something somebody else wrote, because there are earlier harmonizations of the Amazing Grace tune. So he takes that tune that's in the air, gets it in his head. Wow, that's a nice tune. I'm going to harmonize it, writes the beautiful harmony that he wrote in 3 parts. And then he takes those words, and they're inseparable to all of us now, right? I mean, you can write another song that has the Amazing Grace text to it. There's 105 and the Sacred Harp, but those things are inextricably linked. And what's the magic of that? Even if the person didn't have the words in mind when they were writing the tune, or the tune in mind when they were writing the words. Idemea to me is another example of that. Those words and that music go together so beautifully. But they were written by entirely different people at entirely different times. And that one also is most likely based on a folk melody. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think is wonderful and can be instructive to explore if you're writing music in this style, because there are so many great words out there. I can't even imagine how people would write new words that fit the Sacred Harp style, or the idiom of the 18th century hymnody, which is largely what we sing. And people try sometimes. I think it's harder maybe because it's a different language, right? That's an older form of speaking, and it's not maybe necessarily what's in all of our heads anymore in the way it was for people who were singing those hymns in church all the time, and maybe even sometimes spoke that way more than we do now. But I think it's really wonderful and to have the text inform the music. Does that help?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Anyone else? Would you like to hear one last Jack recording, or have you had enough? One more? Okay. If you want to look at page 20 in your booklet, this is the first one she ever sent to me. And again, it was a total surprise. I had no idea, just like those Northern Harmony things. And it just, she did it differently. The tempo is different than what I had in mind when I wrote it. But of course, now I think of it in her tempo. And it's a song, again, that this one's got some tricky intervals in it, and some other funny little things that it does. So maybe it's not Sacred Harp, but maybe that's okay. I've sent this one to the Northern Harmony folks a few times and hoped that they would sing it, but they haven't yet. But anyway, it's called Hatchet Mountain, again, named after a place in Maine because it's sort of in that style of the American Vocalist book that's from there. William Tanser.
It looks like we lost Aldo. But I do have that song. Maybe why don't we listen to it while we wait for Aldo to get back in?
Dear gracious God, my humble moan, to thee I breathe my sighs. When will the moon fall?
yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. And I just want to thank you all for having me, and I hope this was useful or enjoyable for folks. And again, I'd be happy to hear comments about any of it or just have a chat with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aldo. Those are beautiful tunes. Beautiful tunes. I love them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo, for all that research. It was a joy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to invite everyone to the anniversary singing tomorrow, which is at 3501 North Kilbourne in Chicago. And you can go to chicagosingings.org for more information. And yes, we are demanding, I'd say, that you wear masks, because the risk level in Chicago and in Cook County is still medium. If it was light, we'd be more negotiable, but we are asking for you to wear masks. And we hope to see you there.